Good morning, Vietnam. I'm Max. In our presentation, we will analyze 14 primary source documents on the Vietnam War in relation to the Cold War, which are taken from the Cold War, a history and documents and eyewitness accounts, edited by Jussi Hanhimäki and Odd Arne Westad. The main overarching theme of these documents is the geopolitical tension that existed due to the opposing views of the Americans and the North Vietnamese held on the nature of the conflict. For the North Vietnamese, the conflict was a struggle for independence, whereas for the Americans it was a struggle against communist imperialism. This misinterpretation from the American side is exemplified by Robert McNamara, who, in the documentary The Fog of War, blames the American military failure on their failure to empathize with the Vietnamese. The first two documents, which I will discuss, epitomize these opposing conceptions. It is also important to note that, as the group points out in his book A Noble Cause, most of the historiography available to us on the Vietnam War come from American or Western sources, and they have largely not attempted to understand the Vietnamese point of view, which is exactly the same mistake as the American leadership made regarding Vietnam. But first I should explain the colonial background. Vietnam had been part of French Indochina, which was colonized from the mid to the late 19th century. In 1940, after the fall of France to Germany, the Japanese colonized Indochina together with France before taking formal control in March 1945. Later that year, after the Japanese surrendered, the former Emperor Bao Dai handed over power to the Viet Minh. Before the British and the French were able to return, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed Vietnamese independence on September 2nd, which is the first document I will talk about. The Vietnamese Declaration of Independence is highly symbolic, partly because it was declared in front of the French governor's mansion in Hanoi. It also evokes the hypocrisy of French colonial rule in that Ho quotes the rights of man and citizen from revolutionary France, which highlights how equal right applies to all men. He also says how the French have denied the Vietnamese liberty, equality, and fraternity. More relevant to the Vietnamese position in 1945, however, is how Ho begins his declaration by quoting the American Declaration of Independence. This is him pleading for American support for the Vietnamese struggle for independence. The US, since World War I, had a history of promoting self-determination, which was continued under Roosevelt, who was advocating for the dismantling of the old colonial empires. Ho was therefore hopeful that Roosevelt's policy would continue after World War II, which it was to some degree, but anti-colonialism was definitely put aside in favor of anti-communism as the Cold War intensified. In Vietnam, this became very clear after the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War. The idea that FDR wanted an independent Vietnam is backed up by Stan Tønnesen in his 1991 book, where he references the conversations between Roosevelt and Stalin at the Yalta Conference. Moreover, Ho Chi Minh's speech does not focus on communist ideology, but is solely nationalistic and damning of the French and Japanese rule. Ho also evokes the UN conferences of Tehran and San Francisco, where the principles of self-determination and equality among nations were emphasized. In stark contrast to this is the next source, which is a telegram from the Secretary of State John Dulles, with the approval of President Eisenhower to the South Vietnamese leader Diem, which was sent during the Geneva Conference of 1954. This conference came shortly after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where the Viet Minh destroyed the French and thus came to the conference with some leverage. The American backing of Diem, even before the conference was over, shows that they would not allow for a unified election in Vietnam, because Ho Chi Minh would most likely win. In this telegram, the Americans promised to back Diem's southern regime. Dulles presents the situation not in terms of Vietnamese politics, but rather in terms of the international struggle against communism. This telegram exemplifies, as these quotes show, the shift in US priorities as they got dragged deeper into the Cold War. The Americans, at this point, did not wish to intervene militarily, but they did not want Diem to negotiate without the US being involved either. Now Grant will discuss the escalation of the American-Vietnamese War.
Thank you, Max. As the war began around 1955 with the beginning of guerrilla activity in South Vietnam under the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, the United States would substantially contribute to the escalation of the conflict, sending large numbers of troops and arms overseas in its support of the South. If we want to properly understand this escalation, we must consider how its opposing sides somehow both understood the war to be an anti-imperialist conflict. As the leader of the Cold War's nominally democratic Western Bloc, the US pursued a policy of communist containment in Asia. Informed by the domino theory, which held that one state's turning to communism would ease the turn of others, the United States believed that it was opposing an expansionist threat. Note the language used in the Dulles telegram that Max has pointed out. Communist ideology is likened to despotism and imperialism, a threat to the entire free world. American intervention, at least from the perspective of the United States, wasn't imperialist or colonialist in nature. In fact, if anything, it was viewed as anti-imperialist, as demonstrated by the language Dulles uses. The Vietnamese conflict was seen as one of communist containment, as was the case in Korea in 1950. However, the conflict was viewed very differently by the North Vietnamese, who explicitly understood it as a neo-colonialist war. In 1965, a few years into the war, North Vietnamese leader Le Duan wrote to allies in the South that our people are now facing the US, the leading imperialist country, humankind's most fierce enemy. He describes the ongoing conflict repeatedly as a sabotage war and a neo-colonialist war. Le Duan's letter sums up the Northern Vietnamese view of the United States as a Western imperial power looking to enforce its colonialism onto Vietnam. In stark contrast, the United States considered the Vietnam War as a conflict fought against communist aggression in defense of the free world. In a sense, both sides of the Vietnam War imagined themselves as fighting imperialist opponents. As has been noted by Max, this concept plays into the idea of the underlying tension that existed between the conflicting ideas of a struggle for independence versus a war against communism. The political pressure placed on the US and its presidents to act decisively against communism also must be considered when thinking about the war's escalation. The US's international prestige rested on its anti-communist leadership of the Western Bloc, and Presidents Kennedy and Johnson deepened American involvement in the war, in large part, to avoid being seen as going soft on communism. Kennedy, the quintessential Cold Warrior, asserted in his inaugural address that in the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom from its time of imminent danger. I do not shrink from that responsibility. I welcome it. De Groot's A Noble Cause highlights the fact that his administration increased the number of American soldiers in Vietnam from 700 to over 16,000 and initiated covert actions into the north. The documents on the Kennedy administration's decisions on Vietnam and the president's thoughts on the coup that would oust South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem further illustrate Kennedy's commitment to escalating American involvement in Vietnam. President Lyndon Johnson inherited American leadership in the Vietnam War following Kennedy's death and came to feel the dual pressures of international and domestic leadership. This is evident in the telephone call he makes to his political mentor Richard Russell, the excerpt shown here. Communism, an imperialist, expansionist threat from the perspective of the United States, must be opposed for the sake of the US's international standing. Here again is depicted the underlying tension between the United States' anti-imperialist rhetoric and its interventionist policy. Johnson openly expresses his disdain for the Vietnam War and its inevitable death toll, I don't want to kill these folks, but ultimately concludes that military withdrawal would too badly damage American prestige both at home and abroad. Though he may have done so reluctantly, President Johnson went on to increase U.S. fighting strength in Vietnam up to 385,000 by late 1966 and 535,000 by the end of 1967, a staggering increase. Dumbrell's Rethinking the Vietnam War, my source for these figures, notes that Johnson actually had a reasonably clear purpose, to do enough to contain communist advances in Indochina without risking confrontation with the big communist powers. Nevertheless, U.S. involvement in Vietnam deepened significantly, as a war fought to counter communist imperialism increasingly resembled a war of imperial aggression itself. Timo will continue our presentation, detailing the on-the-ground experiences of American and Vietnamese soldiers inevitably impacted by the U.S.'s military escalation.
The majority of the sources in this chapter, as referred to by Max and Grant, relay the words of politicians. The resultant picture of the Vietnam War is of a geopolitical and ideological struggle removed from the realities of the war experienced by soldiers on both sides. Sources 7.7 and 7.8 offer a valuable counterpoint, portraying on-the-ground accounts of the conflict and revealing the human cost of the decisions made by politicians. Source 7.7 is an extract from reporter Michael Herr's account of a soldier in an American military base in Vietnam in 1968. The author is best known for his non-fiction novel, Dispatches, one of the most popular books written on the Vietnam War. As a freelance correspondent in Vietnam between 1967 and 1968, he was able to capture the spirit of the conflict through the events that he witnessed. This particular extract focuses on a young Marine whose tour in Vietnam is coming to an end. Herr describes the damage inflicted on this Marine by the war, both physical in the form of shrapnel wounds and psychological. The Marine's unhinged smile is linked to the same fatigue and glancing madness that Herr identifies in other young soldiers, traumatized by the violence. The Marine reminisces about the time before the fighting escalated, presumably before the Tet Offensive in 1967. He then describes being reduced to living underground like an animal, his sleep indistinguishable from waking. Herr depicts the soldiers as inhabiting a state of flux between boredom and brutality, which gradually drove them mad. Source 7.8, on the other hand, offers an account of a North Vietnamese soldier's experience of the war. It focuses on one particularly brutal battle, using highly emotive language to evoke the visceral nature of the scene. The extract is drawn from a novel called The Sorrow of War by Vietnamese author Bao Ninh, which was published in 1990. It is a semi-autobiographical novel based on the author's recollections of his own experiences in the war. Bao Ninh was one of only 10 survivors from the 500 men in his brigade, a figure indicating the sheer scale of the casualties suffered by the North Vietnamese troops. This source paints a scene of butchery and insanity exacerbated by American military technology. There is a sense that it wasn't just the soldiers who suffered the costs of the battle, but also the land, which is described as having been irreversibly scarred by the destruction. This can be read symbolically. The violation of the land can be considered representative of the damage inflicted on the ideologically divided Vietnamese nation. The protagonist, Kien, returns to the site of the battle in 1974 and prays for the souls of his fallen comrades, an indication of the long-term trauma caused by the war and the way it has lingered in the minds of those who suffered its worst excesses. So how can these two extracts be compared? Both refer to the psychological impact of the violence on the soldiers. Both also focus on the experiences of individuals, applying faces to the statistics. Both are relatively free of propaganda and political discourse, acting instead as testaments to the human cost of the fighting. On the other hand, neither source gives any recognition of the humanity of the enemy. Sympathy in the Herr source is reserved for the Americans, whereas the North Vietnamese are portrayed as the only victims in the sorrow of war. In this sense, the uncompromising political divisions are reproduced in literature through the exclusive focus on either the southern or northern experiences of the conflict. But what is the value of analysing these extracts? What do they contribute to the Cold War narrative? Both Dispatches by Michael Herr and The Sorrow of War by Bao Ninh were very popular, receiving broad circulation in their countries of origin. Hence, in the decades that followed the end of the war, public consciousness in the US and Vietnam about its events would have been significantly shaped by them. The sources are worth studying because the stories they portray are, for many, more representative of the conflict than the political dialogues and behind-the-scenes strategies that shaped its course. Accounts of on-the-ground experiences also played a fundamental role during the conflict in fostering anti-war movements in the US, which I will now let Natalie discuss.
Between 1965 and 1973, thousands of Americans assembled across the country in protest of the Vietnam War. Taking the form of vigils, discussion groups, film screenings, public readings, and marches, the anti-war movement in the United States is one of the largest social movements in the nation's history. This movement was met with adversity as America's involvement in the war became a polarizing subject amongst citizens and specifically the younger generation. Many people saw the Vietnam War as preventing the spread of communism and as an opportunity for the United States to appear more stable on the international stage. While the anti-war movement grew out of pre-existing peace and social justice organizations, the catalyst can largely be attributed to President Johnson's Operation Rolling Thunder, the 1965 bombing campaign against North Vietnam, and the increased number of troops, as previously mentioned by Grant, marked the drastic increase in the United States' involvement at home and abroad. Marked as the first television war, the Vietnam War was the first time that the American public saw both film coverage of a war and of an American defeat abroad. Johnson saw these as connected, as he remarked in his meeting of the National Association of Broadcasters in April of 1968, that no one can understand what those vivid scenes of the Vietnam War can have on American opinion when the television brings the war into the American home. This regular exposure to the realities of a bloody war was arguably a major factor in turning the public against the war. Media following of the Tet Offensive was seen as particularly negative, as it marked the event as a complete defeat, negating the losses of the North Vietnamese in the National Liberation Front. The portrayal of the Tet Offensive reaffirmed that the war was not over yet and marked the Johnson administration as failing the American people. This media coverage coincides with the importance of public demonstrations, as awareness of the movement came primarily through the media's coverage. Peaceful protests came to define the anti-war movement as individuals and groups took their political views to the public stage. Fall anti-war activities culminated in the March of the Pentagon on October 21, 1967, when 50,000 people participated in a Washington, D.C. protest at the Lincoln Memorial. Document 7.9 offers the account of Norman Mailer. A World War II veteran and political activist, he describes the passions of the anti-war movement. He contrasts his account with that of two newspaper accounts, one from an author by the name of Breslin and one by Gerald Long of the National Guardian. The three writers offer similar descriptions in starkly different ways. Mailer is focused primarily on a sense of childishness, noting the protesters to be rebels and radicals and young revolutionaries. His account is far more emotionally removed than that of Breslin's. Breslin states that the taste and decency had left the scene as protesters, whom he saw as dropouts and drifters and rabble, to face the Pentagon. Long's account concludes the 7.9 document with a far more romantic rendering of the events, as he notes the demonstrators as youth crying "Join us" to the soldiers rather than the inflammatory speech that both Mailer and Breslin note. The contrast in their accounts is emblematic both of the widespread coverage and involvement of the public protests in the media, as well as the divisive nature of the public at the time. Much of the historical discourse surrounding the public opinion during the late 1960s and early 1970s focuses on the data produced by the Gallup polls. These polls, aimed at measuring the political and social attitudes of the American public, offer evidence over the course of America's involvement with the Vietnam War. E. M. Schreiber utilizes this data in his outright denial of any causational link between the increase of public protest and the decreasing of American support for the war. Mueller also agreed, citing American casualties as the causal variable, as every time American casualties increased by a factor of 10, support for the war declined by about 15%. The period of the Vietnam War witnessed two major reconstructions of the United States political and popular culture. When Americans could only read about the war was separated from those at home. The introduction of the television and organized mass protests brought about a sense of national connection at home to the war abroad. The American public could not only see and hear the war in their living room, they could also witness fellow civilians protesting in the streets. Olivia will conclude our presentation with the de-escalation of the Vietnam War.
Historians disagree as to what extent the anti-war movement discussed by Natalie impacted the American decision to leave the war. However, most agree that it was one of a number of factors that convinced the United States to begin to slowly withdraw troops from Vietnam in 1969. This drawn-out process of withdrawal culminated in the Paris Peace Accords of 1973, in which the Americans removed the remainder of their troops in exchange for the return of their prisoner of wars. In addition, the demarcation line at the 17th parallel was to be maintained pending Vietnamese negotiation of reunification. The Americans' inability to see the ways in which their actions in Vietnam were interpreted as imperialist, and therefore contrary to the anti-imperialist ideals that the Americans themselves publicly condoned, is seen most clearly in the way in which they approached these negotiations. In the first chapter of the Paris Accords, the United States committed to, quote, respect the independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Vietnam as recognized by the 1954 Geneva Agreements on Vietnam. The reference here to the Geneva Agreements establishes an ironic lens through which we can view the Paris Accords, as the first chapter both reaffirms the U.S. commitment to the self-determination of Vietnam, while also reminding us that the United States has rescinded on a nearly identical commitment in the past. This irony is furthered by the United States' behavior immediately before the accords were signed. Even as the U.S. committed once more to the principle of self-determination, The government was sending threatening letters to Thieu in order to coerce him into signing the agreements. Document 712B is an example of such a letter. Dated 19 January 1973, Nixon wrote, "I am authorizing Dr. Kissinger to initial the agreement even without the concurrence of your government. Should you decide to join us later, the possibility of continued congressional assistance will be severely reduced." The irony here hardly needs mentioning. The United States planned to fully commit to the Paris Accords, which included their written commitment to the self-determination of Vietnam. However, in order to ensure that the South Vietnamese signed off on the accords, the United States threatened to withhold military assistance and financial aid. Thus, although the United States was publicly in favor of allowing Vietnamese autonomy and self-determination, these threats indicate that, under this public facade, they were still trying to manipulate the Vietnamese government while prioritizing their own concern. According to Pierre Asselin, the predominance of this selfishness in American policy was the primary reason for the failure of the Paris Accords to maintain peace in Vietnam. The United States and North Vietnam were willing to let many aspects of the agreement remain vague so that both countries could achieve their immediate objectives, such as the recovery of POWs. The same letter I mentioned earlier supports Asselin's theory, as Nixon insists that Thieu's concerns about the absence of a specific provision for the removal of North Vietnamese troops were unfounded. Nixon's refusal to renegotiate the terms of the agreement so that Thieu was satisfied demonstrates how the Americans continued to prioritize their own objectives over those of the Vietnamese, even when determining an agreement that would predominantly affect the future of Vietnam. Like other imperialist nations, America therefore prioritized its own objectives upon withdrawal rather than trying to help repair the damage it had caused. It immediately tried to distance itself from the problems in Vietnam, as is evidenced in Document 713 by Kissinger actively discouraging Vietnamese representatives from using the term reparation in the context of post-war economic aid. Document 714 is written by Australian reporter John Pilger and recounts the fall of Vietnam. The figure of Colonel Summers, upon which most of the excerpt focuses, can be seen to represent America's participation in the Vietnam War. Colonel Summers committed himself to helping the Vietnamese people during the evacuation, but at a certain point, he was forced to act selfishly and prioritize his own evacuation, leaving the others behind to fend for themselves. Likewise, the United States government had promised, for better or for worse, to help the South Vietnamese fend off communism. But when this endeavor was no longer worth the cost to the United States, they simply left and let South Vietnam deal with the consequences. This behavior is typical of imperialist powers who only pursued communism when the benefits to their country outweighed the costs. The American exit from Vietnam therefore emphasized what the rest of the war illustrated. Although the Americans were outwardly opposed to imperialism and in favor of self-determination, their own actions directly contradicted these values. In our most recent seminar, Akila told us to think carefully about who has the right to speak for whom. During the Vietnam War, the American government assumed that they had the right to speak for the Vietnamese. Though an unmediated Vietnamese voice that expressed outrage at the violence is available to us through Vietnamese literature and on-the-ground accounts, the American voice was prioritized on the international stage at the time and continues to be prioritized in English-language historiography. For the Americans, anti-communism took precedence over anti-colonialism, and the aggressive actions that they took to stop the spread of communism can be interpreted as imperialist in nature. While it is clear that, at least in principle, Americans believed in the importance of self-determination, the choices of other nations were limited to those that the U.S. had already deemed acceptable. In other words, Vietnam was permitted to speak for itself, but only from a script written by the Americans.